And just like that, she appears in the murder corner. Well, maybe not directly in the murder corner, but hello, and welcome back to the last and most famous tourist attraction directly adjacent to the gates of hell. You can peruse the gift shop for cursed objects because that's all we have. I am your cursed tour guide and future ghost with the most, Vivian Noir. That's me. I think I just scared my cat by throwing something on the bed. He was like, "What are you doing, Mom? What are we doing?" Hello to everyone who is in the chat. Hello and thank you for everybody who is joining live tonight. This one's a long one. There's a lot of it. So it is a continuation. If you have not watched of part 1 last week, we talked about the OG of serial killers, himself or herself. That's one of the theories tonight, Jack the Ripper, and got into some gruesome details last week. So I dissected the crimes, as it were. See what I did there. And this week, I'm going to look into the names associated with the case, as well as the most popular and compelling theories about who done it. So there have been, by some estimations, at least 500 people put forth as suspects in the case by various historians, experts, researchers. Some of these names have been proposed on just like really flimsy circumstantial evidence or basically just hearsay or non-existent evidence, pretty much. And a few of these are very popular, unfortunately, theories that don't really have much substance to them. So I will be trying to cover a lot of bases, some of the more popular theories, just because they are popular theories, even if they aren't really substantive. I'm also going to be providing counterproof as to why these popular and flimsy theories are just that, theories. So tonight we are going through the round table of suspects with not 1, not 2, not 3, but 8, up to 10 with 2 bonus. Yes. So we have 8 suspects to cover tonight, plus 2 bonus additional suspects that we'll cover briefly at the end because they're not my favorites. But they are the internet's favorites for some reason. I don't know why that is, but they are, because apparently Reddit has a fan theory for everything these days. If it can ruin Rugrats and 90s cartoons for everybody, well, then I guess it can ruin Jack the Ripper too. So there's a lot of ground to cover on this. Excuse me. Beverage. So let's get into it. Up first on our docket of suspects is mild-mannered Liverpudlian cotton merchant James Maybrick. In 1992, Michael Barrett, a former Liverpool scrap metal merchant, produced a journal which, he had claimed, had been given to him by a friend, Tony Devereaux, in a pub the previous year. Although the author of the diary doesn't actually identify himself by name, it is quite obvious from various personal references and other information contained within the journal that the diarist is meant to be the Liverpool cotton merchant, James Maybrick. Maybrick died in May 1889, and shortly after his death, his wife Florence was arrested and charged with murdering him by poisoning with arsenic. So the theory with James Maybrick is honestly, nobody really heard of this dude until this diary appeared out of the ether. His name was not associated with the case at all. He lived in Liverpool, which is some hundreds of miles from, it's far from London. It's in the greater, I guess, area, but it's not close. So he would have traveled. This would have been somebody who would have traveled back and forth from his home in Liverpool as part of a trade. Ideally, I guess that's the theory, is that he traveled. He would work on weekends, and on weekends he would go to the city to work. And that's where he would do his theoretical stabby stab times. So in the diary, the author makes the claim that he had seen his wife, whom he refers to as the bitch or the whore in the pages of the diary, with an unnamed lover in the Whitechapel district of London. The rage that he experienced following the sighting of the pair sent him on a murderous killing spree, in the course of which he mutilated and killed 5 prostitutes. The journal contains a somewhat long-winded description of the murders before ending with the assertion, quote, "I give my name that all may know of me, so history do tell what love can do to a gentle man born. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper," unquote. Prior to this, though, there wasn't even a single mention of James Maybrick ever being a suspect at all, outside of the rambling confession in the pages of this found diary. So his viability as a suspect seemed to hinge entirely on whether or not the diary, and the details within, could be authenticated. The appearance of the diary divided ripperologists, and the path to proving the guilt or innocence of Maybrick has been anything but uncomplicated. I mean, Hitler diaries, anyone? Usually when things like this just mystically appear out of the mists of history, for whatever reason, are just suddenly found, it's a little suspect. So, of course, next step would be to what? To try to analyze said object to find out if it is indeed the real deal. And that is where things got a little bit sticky. At first examination, the results seemed promising. Several experts agreed that, if nothing else, it was most certainly of the correct period to have been written by James Maybrick. But they also made it very plain that a far more thorough forensic analysis was needed in order to establish exactly when the journal was written. And it was at this point that the scientific data became somewhat blurred and contradictory. So the analysis of the ink was analyzed 3 times, not once, not twice, but thrice, as it were. And all the tests basically were inconclusive. The first test said that yes, it could have been ink from around that time, but it was, that it flagged a certain common chemical in the ink at the time. But then the second test said it did not have that chemical in there. And then the third test was basically, I don't know. It's ink. Like, don't ask us any more questions. Like, so none of the tests were bang on conclusive. So already kind of shaky ground here. Plus, look at that face. That's a face clearly of a cotton-made angel. I don't actually know. Like, I don't know. The guy could have been a monster. The guy could have kicked puppies for fun. I don't know. It also didn't help matters when the diary's discoverer, Michael Barrett, admitted to the Liverpool Post that he, in fact, forged the diary. He later retracted that confession, and his former wife, whom he was separated from at the time, spoke out in his defense at the legitimacy of the diary, suddenly claiming that it had been in her family's possession since the Second World War. Okay, why would you come out? I mean, that to me says that it wasn't real. If you come out and say, yeah, if I faked that, and then went, no, I didn't know. What? I know. Like, yeah, usually the first thing is the right thing. Like, and then suddenly the story changed after that. She said the diary had been in the family since World War II when initially he got it from his friend. So this is getting all kinds of muddy. So the jury is still definitely out on whether or not the diary is real. So what about the details of the actual crimes that are contained within the pages of the diary? Do they demonstrate that the author had first-hand knowledge that could have only been known to the perpetrator of the Jack the Ripper crimes? Well, no. It's apparent on close scrutiny of the diary that many of the descriptions of the crimes and the crime scenes are actually taken from press reports and later accounts of the Jack the Ripper murders, and that, because of this, the journal does repeat some of the widespread inaccuracies and errors with regards to the crime scenes themselves. For example, with the murder of Mary Kelly, the author gloats over how he placed body parts of her all over the room, and goes into sickening details about how he had cut off her breasts and, having kissed them for a while, set them down upon a bedside table. Point of order, for just one brief second. What in the actual giggly fuck? No. No. Did that need to be included? It's like, you already cut off her titties. Like, did we need that too? Did we need that gravy or that cherry on top of the shit sandwich? I don't think we did. And I know what you might be thinking. What kind of sandwich would have a cherry on it? To paraphrase BoJack Horseman, a shitty one. A shitty one, ladies and gentlemen. The idea of Mary Kelly's body parts being spread all over the room, or in some lurid accounts being, quote, hung around the walls like Christmas decorations, was certainly not the case, and there is no denying that the fact inside 13 Miller's Court, where her body was discovered, was horrific, but the mutilated body parts were, on the whole, confined to the bed in the immediate vicinity, and had not been thrown or strewn around the room. As you guys remember from last week, and if you haven't seen it, I do encourage you to go back and watch it. The photos are very graphic, so do please be warned of graphic content. You can see in the crime scene photo, which is the actual crime scene photo, that yes, it's a mess, but it's not like he literally took her organs and threw them around the room like it was parade confetti. Like they're around the bed, but it wasn't like he was going wee and just like it. Yeah. So there were some inaccuracies that were re-reported in the Penny Dreadfuls, and of course, as the story trickled down and became sensationalized because it was such a graphic crime scene that the game of telephone. One story started out and became this giant thing. So that's kind of where this came from. But I was just like, no to all of that. No. Police and other official reports make it obvious that this was not the case. Likewise, her breasts were not placed on a bedside table as is stated in the diary, but were, in fact, found beneath her body. These are just two examples of common fallacies and misconceptions concerning the crime scenes, and which therefore suggest that the diary wasn't written from the authors having any first-hand account of the crime scenes, but rather from somebody that read inaccurate accounts and descriptions of the crime scenes later on. Combined, these tend to cast doubt on the author's viability as a Jack the Ripper suspect. There is, however, another intriguing piece of memorabilia that links Maybrick to the Jack the Ripper crimes. In 1993, Albert Johnson purchased an antique gold watch, on the inside of which he found scratched the initials of Jack the Ripper's 5 victims, together with the signature J. Maybrick and the words, "I am Jack." As with the diary, the watch has been subjected to scientific analysis, and the scratches have been found to be compatible with the period of 1888 to 1889, although these findings also have been disputed. But the sudden appearance of the watch, so soon after the diary was made public, aroused a great deal of suspicion, and, whereas it is possible that they were both created at the same time, their usefulness in proving Maybrick's guilt depends on proving that they are genuine, and unfortunately this has never satisfactorily been done. Maybrick seemed like an odd bird for sure, and a compelling case if true. And while a cotton merchant may have had ample opportunity to travel to London for a murderous weekend getaway, what about an even stranger, eccentric painter with a fascination with the Ripper? Walter Sickert has been implicated in the Ripper crimes as already that face, yikes. That just, I'm ready for my close up leer. I don't know what that, like, Walter, my sweet summer child, what are we doing in that photo? Like, I can't with a that is not the business. That is not Glamour Shots puss. That is not what that is, my dear. Early as the 1970s, but emerged with even more popularity later in light of the royal conspiracy theory and the increasing popularity of DNA forensic technology in the 90s. He was a funny little man with a leaning towards the macabre. He was described as eccentric and peculiar even for the time, and he often painted about the Ripper. He even painted a painting called Jack the Ripper's Bedroom, which looks an awful lot like the bedroom of the last Ripper victim, Mary Jane Kelly. Sickert also, oddly enough, would occasionally dress up as Jack the Ripper. Patricia Cornwell, mystery author and... Okay, we're going to get back to Patricia in just a second. You heard that right. This man would cosplay Jack the Ripper. Like, not on weekends and not, like, for Halloween, but, like, on the reg. Like, would just throw on what he thought the Ripper wore, apparently, and walk the streets of London with impunity. What? Why? What part of this seemed like any kind of good idea? I mean, dude, you're basically cosplaying a serial killer that has never been caught. Okay, so again, your guess on his, like, attire was entirely a guess, unless it was really you, and then you're like, yeah, this is what I wore. I'm just surprised he didn't get like leer around the corner at somebody with that face, with a fucking top hat and an overcoat, going like, "Do you like my costume?" And somebody just pop him right in the face. Like that is that's what should have happened. Like somebody's like, "Ah, murder!" Boom, and then just right in the kisser, pow, right in the kisser, dude. Yeah, no, like totally just would dress up on the regular, just for fun. Just for shits and giggles. Author of Portrait of a Killer, Jack the Ripper, Case Closed, has been a big proponent of Sickert's, even claiming that she has found DNA evidence linking Sickert to at least one of the, quote, Ripper letters. The claim is that Cornwell's team of forensic scientists found a sequence of mitochondrial DNA on several Ripper letters, which matched sequences found on several letters written by Sickert. Specific watermarks were also matched in both Sickert's letters and those sent to police and media. Similar mitochondrial DNA matches were also found on envelopes and other papers. Similar watermarks, names, phrases, drawings have been seen in both the Ripper letters and the Sickert letters. According to Cornwell, who famously purchased one of Sickert's paintings, then proceeded to cut it in half, trying to find some hidden clues. What kind of national treasure? Did anyone tell this woman that that was a movie and that wasn't real? Like, not real. Patricia. Get a grip. Sickert also inserted clues and symbols about the Ripper into drawings and paintings. Some of these clues are so similar to actual crime scenes that only the true murderer could have painted them. Cornwell claims that Sickert was impotent, childless, and had a fistula on his penis. She believes that this led to an intense hatred of women and possibly spurred him to commit the murders. Many serial killers today are found to be impotent, and the act of murder becomes their only means of sexual gratification. Finally, no evidence exists to indicate that Sickert was anywhere but London during the time that the canonical murders between August and November of 1888 were committed, according to Cornwell. Cornwell, painting slashing aside, put together a compelling case that sold a lot of books, but the case she put forward, according to many Ripper researchers, is dubious at best. Most of the letters are considered to be hoaxes. At least 2 people were arrested and charged for hoaxing letters at the time. Interestingly enough, both were women. The Openshaw letter, which according to Cornwell provided similar mitochondrial DNA sequences and watermarks to those found in Sickert's correspondences, has never been considered a genuine Ripper letter by any serious author or researcher. It was sent to Dr. Thomas Horrocks Openshaw, who was widely publicized in papers for having examined the piece of kidney enclosed with the From Hell letter. The only Ripper letter, according to experts, with a strong possible connection to the true murderer is the From Hell letter, and Cornwell found no links in the text of this letter between the author and Walter Sickert. The original letter no longer survives, so DNA and watermark testing would have been impossible. Nuclear DNA tests came back negative, while mitochondrial DNA tests provided similar sequences. These results do not state that Sickert was the author of the letters. They only state that the person who left DNA on Sickert's correspondences could not be eliminated from the percentage of the UK population who could have provided a match. So basically, there's no guarantee that Sickert's the only one who touched these papers. Somebody else could have picked them up at some point, and obviously did if they were moved from his home, and I'm sure that they probably weren't wearing gloves after he died, and his things, his possessions were put away and picked up. So whoever handled these from like him to like when they were actually tested could have, obviously contributed DNA that just, so there's no guarantee that it was his DNA they were actually even testing to in the first place, even though he was a fucking weirdo. Sickert's DNA also no longer exists as he was cremated after his death. Considering the vast number of documents within the Ripper correspondence, the laws of chance that dictate the coincidental similarities will appear. More than 600 letters were sifted through during Cornwell's research. Sickert was obviously interested in the Ripper killings, but art is subjective, so perhaps he was really only sketching and painting a subject he was really interested in. Drawings and sketches are no real evidence, and cutting up the painting was also really dumb. There was no evidence whatsoever that Sickert's fistula was on his penis. The only source of this testimony was of his nephew by marriage, and and I'm sure everybody that just walked in right now was like, there wasn't a fistula on his penis. Well, hey, that's an interesting point to like, and hello and welcome to the conversation. So yeah, there's no evidence of that. I don't know where in Christendom she pulled that from. He did have a fistula, which if anybody's, it's like an open sore. It's like a tumored sore kind of. But I will let myself explain how that is not correct. Claimed it was only family hearsay. While it is recorded that Sickert was treated for a fistula at a point in his life, there is no documentary evidence to suggest that it was on his genitals. The doctors who performed the surgery were known for performing surgeries of the rectum, anus, and vagina. Nothing that says that they were even qualified to perform surgeries on the penis. Wrecked him. It damn near killed him. I'm sorry. I will go now. There was also no evidence that he was impotent. He is rumored to have sired at least one child by his mistress. A close friend of Sickert's, Jacques-Émile Blanche, described Sickert as an immoralist with a swarm of children of provenances which are not possible to count. He had regular mistresses and was cited as being an adulterer by his first wife. There are AKA, he was a fuck boy and had a lot of sex. Okay, that's enough of that. Several independent sources of evidence that indicate Sickert was in France between August and October of 1888. Cornwell admits to a single letter written by Sickert from France during the autumn of 1888. So, with flimsy forensic evidence that would never hold up today in a court of law, it's safe to say that it's likely Sickert was not Jack the Ripper. Was he weird and eccentric like many artists? Yes, but that seems pretty thin ground for an accusation. Seems like a pretty convincing case for Maybrick, and a bit of a flimsy one for Sickert. But this is all assuming that the killer was a man. What if, as some amateur detectives and ripperologists have pointed out, the killer was in fact a woman? In modern times, a woman... Okay, I'm going to stop it for just 1 second, because there is a meme that makes me laugh every time. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Antiques Roadshow. It's a show on like public television, PBS. Here, there is a British. It's I think originally a British show, and people bring things that they have from home, and they bring them to experts to analyze if they're worth any kind of money. Well, somebody online made all these funny memes of joke objects from like Antiques Roadshow, and this picture just reminds me of one of those where it's a doll. And underneath it, it just says, "Oi, mister, you me dad." Like, that's exactly what that picture makes me think of. I will find it so I can share it with you guys later. Can be anything. A race car driver, an astronaut, a physicist. And even though the Jack the Ripper murders did not occur in modern times, even in the late 1800s, women could be more than just cooks, maids, alcoholics, or prostitutes. They could also be Jack the Ripper, at least according to Inspector Aberline. Inspector Aberline first introduced the idea of Jill the Ripper to his mentor, Dr. Thomas Dutton, after Mary Kelly's horrific death. His theory was based on the testimony made by one Carolyn Maxwell. According to official records, Mary Kelly's time of death was somewhere between 3:30 and 4 a.m. on November 9th, 1888. This was based on her body temperature, the rigidity of her body, and the majority of the testimony received from those who heard or saw her. Carolyn Maxwell, however, claims to have seen Mary Kelly twice, several hours after doctors believed she had already been murdered. The first sighting was between 8 and 8:30 in the morning in front of Miller's Court, looking quite ill. She said she was quite sure of the time of day because her husband returned home around 8 a.m. every morning. The second sighting was an hour later when Carolyn Maxwell saw Mary Kelly speaking with a man outside of the Britannia public house. Maxwell claimed that she saw Kelly wearing, quote, a dark shirt, velvet bodice, and a maroon-colored shawl. She also stated that she remembered Mary Kelly wearing the same exact shawl before. Inspector Aberline had no reason to distrust Carolyn Maxwell, and throughout the questioning, she never changed her testimony. I'm sorry, does this woman, I'm just like, the longer I stare at this woman, the more she just looks like bitch Ferratu. Like, I can't with this photo. Like, I would hate to die and then 100-something years later to be remembered this way. That is so disrespectful. So disrespectful. Oh, Lordy. And then the whole thing where she saw, like, oh, yeah, I saw her after she had already died. Well, I mean, is it entirely possible that this woman saw somebody who looked like Mary Kelly? Like, did she see her face? It's not really specified in there of, like, did she see her face and say, oh, yeah, that's her? Or it was just like, oh yeah, I saw somebody wearing a shawl that was the same, because, no two people in London have the same fucking maroon shawl. It must have been this mysterious undead woman. I think the possibility is more likely that somebody else had a maroon shawl, but I'm going to let me continue. I almost said her, like that's a different person. This led Aberline to believe that the murderer was, in fact, a woman who dressed in Mary Kelly's clothes, which is why Carolyn Maxwell claimed to have seen her twice after she was already declared dead by doctors. Dutton was not convinced of his mentee's theory, however. He said that if it were true, he believed Jill to have been a midwife. The theory of Jill the Ripper was never fully explored until William Stewart came along with his book, Jack the Ripper, A New Theory. In the book, he looked at 4 key questions to narrow down who Jill the Ripper could have been. Number 1, what sort of person was it that could move around at night without arousing suspicions? Number 2, who could walk through the streets with blood-stained clothing and, again, not arouse suspicion? Number 3, who would have the elementary knowledge and skill to have committed the mutilations? Number 4, who could have been found by the body and yet given a satisfactory alibi for being there? A midwife or even an abortionist could easily answer all 4 of these questions without arousing the suspicion of the authorities. And given that only women served as midwives or abortionists at the time, this seems a pretty solid theory. But did the victim seek out the services of a midwife or abortionist? There was a theory that followed this, that Mary Kelly was indeed 3 months pregnant at the time of her death, and having no way to care for a child, called for an abortionist to terminate the pregnancy, and the abortionist subsequently murdered her in supremely gory fashion. However, because that follows, why would you kill one of your clients? Like, yeah, I'm gonna come do this for you. Oh, and by the way, stab, 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 chop you into pieces. Like, did she not tip? Like, what would be the motive there? I don't understand the motive of that at all. This is only a theory. There was no evidence that she or any of the other victims were ever pregnant. Stewart also believed that the mutilations and removal of the organs were from a killer who, quote, held a psychological fascination and horror for all women, unquote. But who did he think was Jill the Ripper? Stewart believed it could have been Mrs. Mary Piercy. Piercy had stabbed her lover's wife and child to death and then cut their throats, quote, later wheeling the bodies into a secluded street, unquote, in October of 1890. Because of the savageness of the killing and the public dump sites, Piercy's modus operandi was very similar to that of Jack the Ripper. It's a very interesting theory, but to believe it is another story. There is very little evidence, much of which is weak, relying on the killer being bloodstained and for the victims to have been pregnant, which there is no evidence that any of them were. But who knows, maybe somebody already did solve the case with DNA evidence. Or maybe I'm just jumping to conclusions. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry. This woman looks like she could eat an apple through a picket fence. That is the last thing I will say about this poor woman's photo. I promise. But lordy, Michael Jordy. I cannot with this. So yeah, I don't know. The Jill the Ripper theory has always been kind of a interesting one to me, just because, yes, that would be likely the most likely person who could get away with walking down the streets with bloodstained clothing and not be questioned. And of course, women were never really suspected of anything back in those days, so they could have easily, I mean, Lizzie Borden, anybody, women were thought to be too weak to be able to commit any crimes like that. So it's possible, but the whole the fact that they called on the person to maybe make an appointment, I don't know. Maybe she was just lurking the streets too, and just lurking and deciding to kill people just like a man was. I don't know. Not sure. But the problem is with that is that most of the suspects were last seen in the vicinity of a male. So there goes that theory. Sort of. Maybe. I don't know. Conclusions. Jump with me. It's fun. And all the popular kids are doing it. It's true. Here's the case for and against suspect Aaron Kosminski. One of the more popular suspects to come to light in recent times is Aaron Kosminski. He emigrated from Poland sometime around 1880 to 1881. In London, Kosminski embarked on a career as a barber in Whitechapel, an impoverished slum in London's East End that had become home to many Jewish refugees who were fleeing economic hardship in Eastern Europe and the pogroms in Tsarist Russia. However, he may have worked only sporadically. It was reported in later medical records that he had, quote, not attempted any kind of work for years by 1891. He possibly relied on his sister's families for financial support and may have lived with them at 3 Scion Square in 1890 and 16 Greenfield Street in 1891, indicating that his sisters possibly shared responsibility for caring for him, and he alternated living between their family homes. There is one brief glimpse of him in the public record around the time of the Whitechapel murders. In December 1889, he was one of several people who were summoned to appear at the Guildhall Court in the City of London for having unmuzzled dogs on a public thoroughfare, but not for any violent crimes.
Nothing stabby.
On the 12th of July, 1890, Kosminski was placed in the Mile End Old Town Workhouse due to his worsening mental illness, with his brother Wolf certifying the entry, but he was released 3 days later. On February 4th, 1891, he was returned to the workhouse, possibly by the police, and on the 7th of February, he was transferred to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum. A witness to the certification of his entry, recorded as Jacob Cohen, gave some basic background information and stated that Kosminski had threatened his sister with a knife. It is unclear, however, whether this meant Kosminski's sister or Cohen's sister. Kosminski remained at Colney Hatch Asylum for the next 3 years until he was admitted on April 19, 1894, to Leavesden Asylum. Case notes indicate that Kosminski had been ill since at least 1885. His insanity took the form of auditory hallucinations, a paranoid fear of being fed by other people that drove him to pick up and eat food dropped as litter, and a refusal to wash or bathe. The cause of his sanity was recorded as self-abuse, which is also thought to be a euphemism for masturbation. His poor diet seems to have kept him in an emaciated state for years. His low weight was recorded in the asylum case notes. By February 1919, he weighed just 96 pounds. He died the following month, age 53. An 1894 memorandum written by Sir Melville Macnaghten, the Assistant Chief Constable of the London Metropolitan Police, names one of the suspects as a Polish Jew, Kosminski, without any first name listed. Macnaghten's memo was discovered in the private papers of his daughter, and an abridged version from the archives of the Metropolitan Police was released to the public in the 1970s. Macnaghten stated that there were strong reasons for suspecting Kosminski because he, quote, had a great hatred of women with strong homicidal tendencies, unquote. In 1910, Assistant Commissioner Sir Robert Anderson claimed in his memoirs, The Lighter Side of My Official Life, that the Ripper was a, quote, low-class Polish Jew. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, who led the Ripper investigation, named the man as Kosminski in notes handwritten in the margin of his presentation copy of Anderson's memoirs.
Again, no first name given. So here's the thing. Unless they're talking about someone else with that same last name, there's nothing really. The records on Aaron Kosminski are spotty at best, other than when he is admitted to hospitals. He was obviously a paranoid schizophrenic, but there is no actual record of him being violent. Like, he wasn't violent, like, ever. And there's no record of him attacking anybody ever or anything like that. So it's really interesting that they would just hone in on this person. For other than obviously racist reasons, there was a lot of anti-Semitism going around at the time in London, unfortunately, that they thought that an Englishman couldn't do these terrible crimes, that it had to have been one of these immigrants that had done it. So, little xenophobia may be playing into the mix. But other than that, there's really not much. But let's get into a little bit more of it. If I can find the play button. There we go.
He added that Kosminski had been watched at his brother's house in Whitechapel by the police, and that he was taken with his hands tied behind his back to the workhouse, and then to Colney Hatch Asylum, and that he died shortly after. The copy of Anderson's memoirs containing the handwritten notes by Swanson was donated by his descendants to Scotland Yard's Crime Museum in 2006. Schizophrenic, delusional, paranoid, and incoherent are all characteristics displayed by Aaron Kosminski, but there are numerous arguments against his having been Jack the Ripper. Swanson apparently knew little about Kosminski's fate, as he didn't, as Swanson claimed, die shortly after being admitted to Colney Hatch Asylum. In fact, he lived for many more years, transferring to Leavesden in 1894, where he did eventually die in 1919. Throughout the entire period of his confinement, Aaron Kosminski was never classified as homicidal, and it specifically stated in his records that he was not a danger to others.
Some of his notes state that he was excitable, but the only mention of his being violent was that he once grabbed a chair and made to strike an attendant with it. Anderson and Swanson were two of the highest-ranking officers with direct responsibility for the Ripper investigation, and they were both in a position to know the evidence against all the suspects. And while Kosminski was high on their list of suspects at the time of the crimes, unless they were referring to a different Kosminski, or there is more information about him that has yet to come to light, there is little evidence to link Aaron Kosminski to the Jack the Ripper murders, at least until September 2014. On September 7, 2014, Dr. Jari Luhalainen, an expert in historic DNA analysis, announced that he had been commissioned by British author Russell Edwards to study a shawl said to have been found with victim Catherine Eddowes, and that he had extracted mitochondrial DNA that matched the female line of descendants of Eddowes and mitochondrial DNA that matched the female line of descendants of Kosminski's sister from the shawl. Luhalainen stated that, quote, the first strand of DNA showed a 99.2% match, as the analysis instrument could not determine the sequence of the missing 0.8% fragment. On testing the second strand, we achieved a perfect 100% match, unquote. In his book, Naming Jack the Ripper, Edwards named Aaron Kosminski as Jack the Ripper. Edwards said he was inspired to try to solve the case after the release of the film From Hell in 2001, inspired by the comic of the same name about the Whitechapel murders. He bought the shawl at an auction and commissioned Luhalainen with Dr. David Miller to analyze it for forensic DNA evidence. Edwards states that Kosminski was on a list of police suspects, but that there was never enough evidence to bring him to trial at the time. Kosminski died at the age of 53 of gangrene of the leg in a London mental hospital in 1919. He said that the DNA samples provided that Kosminski was, quote, definitely, categorically, and absolutely the person responsible for the Whitechapel murders committed by Jack the Ripper. I've got the only piece of forensic evidence in the whole history of the case, he told The Independent. He continued, I've spent 14 years working on it, and we have definitely solved the mystery of who Jack the Ripper was. Only non-believers that want to perpetuate the myth will doubt. This is it now. We have unmasked him, unquote.
Did we?
Professor Sir Alec Jeffreys, the forensic scientist who invented DNA fingerprinting in 1984, initially commented that the find was, quote, an interesting but remarkable claim that needs to be subjected to peer review, with detailed analysis of the provenance of the shawl and the nature claimed that the DNA match with the perpetrator's descendants and its power of discrimination, unquote. Jeffreys and others later stated that a claim presented in the book as statistically significant match with the DNA from Eddowes' descendant, a sequence variation described as 314.1c, and claimed to be rare, was the result of an error in nomenclature for the common sequence 315.1c, which is present in more than 99% of people of European descent.
So, oops. Oops. Yeah, somebody made a typo, and the strand that was supposed to be, it's really rare, and it's not found in a lot of people, was actually ended up being found in like 99% of the population. So basically back to square one. And the fact that they refused to kind of submit it to peer review for a really long time that seems kind of suspect. If you were really solid with the science and if you were really confident in your results, wouldn't you allow a peer review? Because you would know that what they were going to find was legit and genuine? I would think so.
Former City of London police officer and crime historian Donald Rumbelow criticized the claim that evidence proved Kosminski was Jack the Ripper, saying that no shawl was listed amongst Eddowes' effects by police. Mitochondrial DNA expert Peter Gill said the shawl is, quote, of dubious origin and has been handled by several people who could have shared that mitochondrial DNA profile, unquote. The shawl or other material could have been contaminated before or while DNA was being tested. 2 of Eddowes' descendants are known to have been in the same room with the shawl for 3 days in 2007, and, in according to the words of one critic, quote, the shawl has been openly handled by loads of people and been touched, breathed, or spat upon, unquote.
And they licked it a whole bunch. Like, they just were in the room just going to town. Yeah, so the shawl, there's no record of the shawl being listed in evidence.
And also, there was no chain of custody kind of stuff at the time. So even if there was, that shawl's been handled by who knows how many people. Like I said, plus people were left with it unsupervised. There's no way of telling like how many people have touched this thing. So, Despite the criticisms, Louhelainen continued to defend his work. Louhelainen's 2014 findings were criticized as they had not been subjected to peer review by other scientists or investigators. In March 2019, the Journal of Forensic Scientists published a study analyzing the mitochondrial DNA from cells extracted from a shawl claimed to have been found near the body, as well as samples of the maternal relations of victim and suspect. This study, conducted by scientists at Liverpool's John Moores University and the University of Leeds, stated in its conclusion that, quote, the presence of mitochondrial DNA on the shawl matches the female victim's mitochondrial DNA derived from stains on it, and that mitochondrial DNA also on the shawl matches the suspect candidate's maternal DNA. However, figure 7 of the same paper shows differences between the suspect's candidate's DNA sequence and the sequence obtained from the shawl. And in their conclusion, the authors state that, according to guidelines, if the samples have 2 or more nucleotide position differences, they can be excluded as coming from the same source or maternal lineage, except when heteroplasmy is encountered. There was no suggestion that heteroplasmy was present. So blah, 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 science, blah, 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 there was no match. So when it was retested in 2019, which is 5 years after the original test, by another university and by independent reviewers to do a peer review, there was nothing. They found what they thought was an initial match, and then there were some differences that basically excluded Kosminski. So, and again, there's no way of knowing how many people touch this thing, how many other people's DNA is on this thing. So it seemed promising. It was really it hit the news. It was world news in 2014 when it happened and when they tested it and when they initially got those results and they thought they had it. That news went across the world because, this is one of the most famous unsolved cases of all time. So to be able to solve that would be, fucking groundbreaking. But turns out we didn't. It'd be nice if we could, but still, it's just, nope. Nope. Not quite. Not on tonight. So, basically, no DNA match. Womp womp. Womp womp. But everybody
Womp womp.
loves a good conspiracy theory, especially the internets. So it should be no surprise that there exists a pretty big one out there in case of Jack the Ripper, known as the Royal Conspiracy Theory.
Oh, this one's
It's every bit as fancy as it sounds. Prince Albert Victor Christian Edward, known as Eddie to his friends, is undoubtedly one of the most famous suspects.
That is too many names. Too many names.
In the Jack the Ripper case, figuring as the central suspect in no less than 3 major theories. Eddie was born in 1864 to Prince Albert Edward, known as Bertie, and son to Queen Victoria. Bertie would later become King Edward VII after his mother's death in 1902. By most reports, Eddie was a slow child who grew up to be a rather dull adult. James Pope Hennessy said of him, quote, even his nearest and dearest, who were naturally bent on making the best of poor Prince Eddie, could not bring themselves to use more positive terms. Prince Eddie was certainly dear and good, kind and considerate. He was also backwards and utterly listless. He was self-indulgent and not punctual. He had been given no proper education, and as a result, he was interested in nothing. He was as heedless and as aimless as a gleaming goldfish in a crystal bowl, unquote.
Yikes. 18th century burn.
There were unconfirmed rumors that Eddie was mildly retarded. He required a tutor while at Cambridge and was also partially deaf, owed to inbreeding and genetic hearing problems. He also had an unusually long and thin neck, which required him to wear long starched collars and led to him receiving the nickname collars and cuffs.
Too many names, too much neck. Continue.
During the murders, Eddie was never named as a suspect. People may not have even considered it, or maybe were too afraid of being off with the old-headed by the royal family. It wasn't until much later that the theory about Eddie and the, quote, royal conspiracy were officially put forth. Other theories abound about Eddie himself being the killer, driven to madness by syphilis and eventually dying in a private mental hospital, but these pale in comparison to the true wackiness of the conspiracy itself. In 1973, the BBC program Jack the Ripper aired. The story goes that the producers of the program were told to contact a man named Sickert, who knew about a secret marriage between Eddie and a poor Catholic girl named Annie Crook. The man, Joseph Sickert, was none other than the son of painter and also Ripper suspect, Walter Sickert. As Joseph tells it, heard from his father, Walter had lived in the East End during the time of the murders and was supposedly a close friend of the royal family. Princess Alex asked Sickert to take Eddie under his wing and keep watch over him. Sickert eventually introduced Eddie to Annie Crook, a poor girl who worked in one of the local shops on Cleveland Street. Soon, Annie fell pregnant by the prince, and they were living a happy, normal life with their daughter until Queen Victoria learned of her grandson's indiscretion and demanded that the situation be handled.
And said, "We are not amused. Go get that fucker."
Not only was Crook a commoner, but she was Catholic as well, and a belief that there may be a Catholic heir to the throne could spark a revolution. The Queen gave over the matter to the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, to handle, and he, in turn, went to Sir William Gull, Eddie's private physician. A daring raid was performed on the Cleveland Street home. Eddie was taken away, and Annie was sent to one of Gull's private hospitals, where Gull performed experiments on her to erase her memory and drive her insane. Their child, however, escaped unharmed with her nanny, Mary Kelly. Kelly had been a co-worker of Annie's as well as one of Sickert's models. Knowing that the game was afoot, Kelly hid the child with nuns and fled into the East End. Eventually, she told this story to several of her cronies, Nichols, Stride, and Chapman, and they eventually decided to blackmail the government when they needed money to pay local protection thugs. When Lord Salisbury learned of the threat, he called on Gull once more. Gull invented an elaborate scheme to silence the women based on Masonic rituals. Enlisting the help of a coachman, John Netley, he created Jack the Ripper as a symbol of Freemasonry. Sir Robert Anderson was enlisted to cover up the crimes and acted as a lookout during the murders. Eddowes, Sickert said, was a mistake, since she often went by the alias Mary Kelly, and it was a simple case of mistaken identity.
That's when you thought there wasn't Freemasons. Boop, it's Freemasons. It's Freemasons, y'all. We gotta tie all the tinfoil hat into this one. So not only does it include another suspect, Walter Sickert, it includes the royal family, it includes the Freemasons, and it includes driving some people crazy with medical experiments. Why has no one made a musical about this? I'm just saying, Broadway, fucking get on it.
The real Mary Kelly was found last and finally silenced. The conspiracy eventually closed in on itself and chose Montague John Druitt as a scapegoat to take the fall, and, as Sickert implied, Druitt was murdered for it rather than committing suicide as the papers claimed. The daughter of Eddie and his Catholic lover, Alice, grew up and, by a series of odd twists and turns, eventually married Walter Sickert and gave birth to his son Joseph.
Ew. So my brain hurt at doing the math on that one, because obviously Walter Sickert was not a child when he was supposedly told to keep an eye on the prince. He was also an adult when this girl was an infant. Ew. Ew. Fucking ew.
Who conveyed the tale. Couple of problems, though. There are no birth records or marriage records existent that list Eddie as Annie Crook's husband or Alice's father. In fact, there is no hard evidence whatsoever linking Cleveland Street, Crook, or Sickert. Perhaps more importantly, examinations of court and royal records reveal that Eddie was not even in London on the important murder dates. That one's a bit out there, I warn you.
I did warn you. That one was crazy. Tinfoil hat time for sure. And of course, as conspiracy theorists will say, they're not going to leave documents of these things out there. They're going to destroy everything. So that's the other side of this one, that people are like, well, there wouldn't be a paper trail and they wouldn't leave court documents out because they tried to deep six everything. So do with that what you will. And I just bounced back to how did the freak did I do that? Okay. That play button, y'all, is real tiny.
Hospital, but these pale in comparison to the
we're gonna
or Carl
was
found last and finally silenced. The conspiracy eventually closed in on itself and chose Montague John Druitt as a scapegoat to take the fall.
We'll get to
and,
him.
as Sickert implied,
He's in here
Druitt
too.
was murdered for it rather than committing suicide as the papers claimed. The daughter of Eddie and his Catholic lover, Alice, grew up and by a series of odd twists and turns eventually married Walter Sickert and gave birth to his son Joseph, who conveyed the tale. Couple of problems, though. There are no birth records or marriage records existent that list Eddie as Annie Crook's husband or Alice's father. In fact, there is no hard evidence whatsoever linking Cleveland Street, Crook, or Sickert. Perhaps more importantly, examinations of court and royal records reveal that Eddie was not even in London on the important murder dates. That one's a bit out there, I warned you.
It's true.
But it's a fun one if you're into the big budget sort of TV show kinds of twists that are popular amongst internet fan theories. From a theory that is popular on the internet to a man that we don't know much about at all, I have about to lay the case out for the next suspect in the lineup, Carl Feigenbaum. Carl Ferdinand Feigenbaum was born in 1894, and that is about the only information that has been confirmed.
Other than the fact that it looked like he was made of wax.
Feigenbaum claimed he was born in Karlsruhe, a city in South Germany close to the French border, and then later said he was born in Kapelheim, despite it not being an actual city. Even his real name is uncertain. Carl Feigenbaum was also known as Karl Zahn, or Karl Zahm, Anton Zahn, or Anton Zahm, or Karl Stroband. In addition to confusion over his name and his birthplace, it is unsure whether he was ever married, he may or may not have been, or if he ever had any children. He is said to have had 2 sisters and 1 brother that he claimed lived in Germany, but then later said that he had a brother who lived in Brooklyn, who may or may not have been the one from Germany. He was a sailor for some or most of his life, but stopped somewhere between 1891 and 1892 when he emigrated to the United States.
Yeah, apparently his name was also John Jacob Jingleheimer Schmidt, and that's my name too.
However, there is no record of him entering the United States illegally, so it's very likely that he sailed to the United States, walked off the boat, and decided to stay. His time in the U.S. between 1890 and September 1st, 1894, is also very unclear. He claimed he worked as a gardener on Long Island, then later claimed to be a florist. All that's really known is that he worked with plants in some capacity on and off as he traveled the United States. His own brother even said, quote, "I saw and knew so little of him that I do not know where he went in the last few years. He was all over the West and traveled a great deal," unquote. So why are we talking about Carl Feigenbaum? Because of a little thing known as murder. Carl Feigenbaum was convicted and found guilty of the murder of Juliana Hoffman and sentenced to execution via electric chair. Juliana Hoffman was a 56-year-old widow who lived with her 16-year-old son Michael in 2 rooms, the front room, which overlooked the street, and the back, which overlooked the yard, above a store on 544 East 6th Street in New York. The mother and son came to the U.S. from Budapest, Hungary in 1892 and lived off Michael's meager wages. Needing extra money, they decided to rent out their furnished back room. Unfortunately, their first and last lodger was none other than Carl Feigenbaum.
He rented out their furnished back room, all right.
He had been doing odd jobs and sleeping on park benches prior to answering Hoffman's ad on Wednesday, August 29th. He had no money, but said that he had been promised a new job at a florist shop and would be able to pay rent, $1 a week plus 8 cents a day for breakfast, as soon as he was paid on Saturday. Hoffman trusted him at his word and allowed him to stay. On August 31st, Juliana went to an unlocked closet and withdrew some money from a small change purse kept there to purchase bread for supper. Once she took the money, she replaced the purse and closed the door, a mundane fact that will become relevant later. At around 10 p.m., everyone went to bed. Feigenbaum retired to his room, and Juliana settled onto her lounge near one of the front 2 windows, and Michael took his spot on the couch at the foot of.
Hold on. All I'm picturing because the guy seriously looks like a wax fucking figurine from Madame Tussauds. So I'm picturing when it's like, oh, he retired to his room. He retired to his room to go stand in front of the window and scare small children by pretending to be a mannequin.
Her bed. Sometime after midnight, Michael awoke to a scream. He saw his mother sitting up in bed and Feigenbaum standing over her with a long carving knife. Michael kicked him and then attempted to attack him from behind. However, Feigenbaum turned on him with the knife, forcing Michael to flee for his life, escaping out of the window and onto the cornice over the shop's front. As he screamed for help, Feigenbaum returned his attention to the older woman and stabbed her in the left side of the neck, drawing it forward into the right some 6 inches, severing her jugular vein. After killing Juliana, Feigenbaum fled out the back window and climbed down to the yard where the alleyway met the street. Michael, from atop the cornice, yelled, "Murder! Police!" which got the attention of a local beat cop and neighbors who arrived just as Feigenbaum emerged from the alley with no jacket, no shoes, or hat. He tried to run but was quickly caught, and then
no shirt, no shoes, no alibi either.
A knife was found. The police brought Feigenbaum up to the apartment, perhaps to allow Juliana to identify her attacker. Unfortunately, she was either dead or almost dead at the time. But Michael was able to identify him and pointed out that the closet where his mother's purse had been kept was open when it had been closed when they went to bed, giving Feigenbaum robbery as a motive for killing the woman. When brought before Justice Sims the next day at Essex Market Police Court, Feigenbaum asserted that it was not him, but his friend, Jacob Weibel, who killed the widow. He said he met Weibel while tramping through the
"It wasn't me, it was a one-armed Weibel!"
countryside, and that they traveled together, and that he would allow Weibel to sneak in to sleep in the room that he was renting from the Hoffmans. No one believed Feigenbaum's story, and he was found guilty during his trial based on the evidence and sentenced to death. His lawyers, in a last-ditch effort to save his life, tried to plead insanity, but after being examined and declared sane by Dr. Carlos MacDonald on March 19, 1896, Feigenbaum was executed on April 26, 1896. So why do we care about Carl Feigenbaum and the murder he committed in New York City when we're talking about Jack the Ripper, who was active in London? Well, after his execution, one of his lawyers, William S. Lawton, declared, quote, "I believe that Carl Feigenbaum, whom you have just seen put to death in the electric chair, can easily be connected with the Jack the Ripper murders in Whitechapel, London," unquote. He believed this because Feigenbaum allegedly confessed to him, quote, "I have for years suffered from a singular disease, which induces an all-absorbing passion. This passion manifests itself in a desire to kill and mutilate every woman who falls in my way. At times, I am unable to control myself," unquote. Lawton also said that when he looked up the dates of the London murders and asked Carl if he was in the city from one date to the next, Carl simply said yes and then went silent. He also looked into Feigenbaum's supposed record and gathered that he had traveled all over the US and Europe at a time when several Ripper-like murders were reported in those same locations. Trevor Marriott, author of Jack the Ripper, The 21st Century Investigation, went a step further and looked at ship records, believing the killer to have been a merchant seaman. In all of his research, he found a list of Ripper-like murders that occurred throughout Europe and US at a time when Feigenbaum was in Germany and then sailing between Europe and North America. Many of these murders included the dismemberment and mutilation of prostitutes. He also found that after Feigenbaum was executed, the Ripper-like murders around the world stopped. Is Feigenbaum the Ripper? It's hard to say. Both Lawton and Marriott present a good case, but there are flaws in both of their theories. First, with Lawton, the confession came at a very convenient time, while he was trying to secure an insanity defense for Carl. And if he really did feel that his client was Jack the Ripper, why wait so long to say anything? Especially when the alleged killer wasn't alive to confirm or deny the details or events of the confession. And with Marriott's theory, the murder of, quote, Lottie Morgan, who was a prostitute murdered in Hurley, Wisconsin, a murder which was reported to have equaled, quote, in horror to any of the Whitechapel crimes, unquote, was actually tied to a bank robbery, and Lottie was actually murdered before she could testify at the trials of the two men accused of the robbery. Plus, Feigenbaum's English was not great. Save for the From Hell letter, Jack the Ripper did seem to have a masterful grip on the English language, drawing more doubt to the Feigenbaum theory.
Carl, he's got a pretty tenuous grasp on the English language there. Carl, what's my favorite movie? Garbledina! Fact 2, Garbledina. Continue.
It's highly unlikely that this German sailor turned gardener turned florist turned murderer was old Saucy Jackie himself, given the evidence, but perhaps one of our other suspects could have been the culprit. Perhaps even a mysterious teacher who committed suicide shortly after the killings stopped. Here's the case for and against Montague John Druitt. Montague John Druitt was the favored suspect of Melville McNaughton, Assistant Chief Constable of the London Metropolitan Police,
and also looked like he owned a fainting couch. Continue.
And famed scapegoat of the royal conspiracy theory. Druitt worked as a barrister and supplemented his income by working as an assistant schoolmaster at a boarding school in Blackheath, southeast London, that was run by Mr. George Valentine. In his memoranda, McNaughton lists 3 suspects who were his likely top suspects. In this, Druitt is described by McNaughton as, quote, a doctor of about 41 years of age in a fairly good family who disappeared at the time of the Miller's Court murder and whose body was found floating in the Thames on the 31st of December, i.e. 7 weeks after the said murder. The body was said to have been in the water for a month or more. From private information, I have little doubt that his own family suspected this man of being the Whitechapel murderer. It was alleged that he was sexually insane, unquote. There are several facts that are correct in this. At the end of November 1888, for reasons that haven't ever been established, Druitt was suddenly and summarily dismissed from his position at the school. A month later, on December 31st, 1888, his body was found floating in the Thames at Chiswick. It had been in the river for some time. On the 5th of January, 1889, the Acton, Chiswick, and Turnham Green Gazette reported on the inquest into Druitt's death and quoted the testimony of his brother. Quote, William H. Druitt said he lived at Bournemouth and that he was a solicitor. The deceased was his brother, who was 31 last birthday. He was a barrister at law and an assistant master in a school at Blackheath. He had stayed with witnesses at Bournemouth for a night towards the end of October. Witness heard from a friend on the 11th of December that the deceased had not been heard from at his chambers for more than a week. Witness then went to London to make inquiries, and at Blackheath he found that the deceased had gotten into serious trouble at the school and had been dismissed. That was on the 30th of December. Witness had the deceased's things searched where he resided and found a paper addressed to him. The coroner read the letter, which was to this effect, quote, Since Friday I felt like I was going to be like Mother, and the best thing for me was to die, unquote. Witness, continuing, said that the deceased had never made any attempt on his life before. His mother became insane in July last. He had no other relative, unquote. The jury at the inquest into the death duly returned a verdict of suicide by drowning, quote, whilst of unsound mind, unquote. Druitt's body was returned to his family for burial, and his name would have likely been long forgotten had McNaughton not written his memorandum and named him as one of the favored suspects in the hunt for the Whitechapel murderer.
So, basically, this poor guy that probably owned a fainting couch, I mean, again, yeah, look at that hair part, look at that tie knot. Probably owned a fainting couch and at least once went onto it. Had some really shitty stuff happen in his life, probably committed suicide because of the shitty stuff that happened in his life, not to mention possibly had mental illness issues that were unresolved because his mother went crazy. And apple doesn't usually fall too far from the crazy tree. So happened to commit suicide around the time that the Jack the Ripper murders happened, and that gets him named a suspect. Can you imagine? First of all, okay, the audacity of this inspector just to go, well, I mean, he committed suicide around the time, so that's evidence. Is it? Is it, Melville? Is it really? Do you have pockets to carry around all that extra audacity that you have? Excuse me, sir. No. The fact that this man just happened to commit suicide around the time and you're like, yep, the murder stopped after that. Case closed. We're done. Lock it up. Let's go home. What in the street walking, pillow talking, walking down to Electric Avenue motherfuck is that? What kind of police work? Excuse me. No, that is not how we inspect things, sir. On the face of it, Druitt makes a strong suspect for the mantle of Jack the Ripper, and the fact that Melville McNaughton himself favored him as a suspect most certainly makes the case against him a compelling one. Furthermore, the timing of his suicide would explain why the murder ceased after Mary Kelly was found dead at Miller's Court. Then, of course, there is McNaughton's assertion that Druitt's own family believed him to be the Ripper. On the strength of this seemingly strong evidence against him, there is a great temptation to declare the Jack the Ripper case closed with the death of Montague John Druitt. Indeed, for many years, many historians believed that to be the case, and Druitt was a suspect of choice to many Ripperologists. But, on closer inspection, the case against Druitt quickly begins to fall apart.
McNaughton makes several fundamental factual errors in the information he provides about Druitt. Firstly, he's about 10 years off with regards to Druitt's age, as Druitt was in fact, according to his brother during testimony, 31, not 41 when he died.
It's a big difference.
Secondly, although several members of his family were doctors, Druitt emphatically was not. McNaughton further...
So you have 3 facts in your memorandum, and you have been wrong on 2 of them. What kind of Keystone Cop is this motherfucker? This is the same one that was like, it was the Jews did it. Okay, dude, like, I'm really starting to question your detective abilities at this point. Sherlock Holmes, this motherfucker is not.
Statement that, quote, the murderer's brain gave way altogether after his awful glut in Miller's Court, and that he immediately committed suicide did not apply to Montague John Druitt. Indeed, his mind was sound enough in the days following the murder of Mary Kelly for him to be actively pursuing his career as a lawyer. Furthermore, he continued to work as a teacher at Valentine's School until his dismissal at the end of November, some 3 weeks after the death of Mary Kelly. Since he probably committed suicide around that time, it would seem likely that he killed himself as a tragic response to his dismissal. The compelling evidence for Druitt's guilt is most certainly the fact that his own family apparently believed him to have been the murderer. But on closer inspection, even this claim doesn't stand up to scrutiny, as it appears to be based on hearsay rather than hard evidence.
Shocker.
McNaughton doesn't say that Druitt's family had any concrete proof that he was the Ripper, but only states that they had their suspicions about him. Furthermore, McNaughton apparently didn't hear of any of these suspicions directly from the family, but, to quote his own words, quote, from private information I have little doubt his family believed him to be the Ripper, unquote.
Okay, so I have suspicions that hot dogs are made of raccoon meat and shoes, but that doesn't make it fucking so. I'm not gonna go storm the fucking gates of the goddamn Oscar Mayer factory with those facts, because I don't know. There's a difference between evidence and hearsay, Melville. Did we not learn that in police school, day 1? Okay, just checking.
Said private information may therefore have been little more than third-hand hearsay. The biggest objection to Druitt as a viable suspect is that Inspector Aberline, one of the main Scotland Yard inspectors on the Ripper case, most certainly didn't think he could have been the Ripper. In an interview with the Pall Mall Gazette in 1903, Aberline is quoted as saying, quote, I know all about that story, but what does it amount to? Simply this. Soon after the last murder in Whitechapel, the body of a young doctor was found in the Thames, but there is absolutely nothing beyond the fact that he was found at that time to incriminate him, unquote. Finally, nothing that is known about Druitt suggests that he ever visited Whitechapel, nor that he had any knowledge of the area. As a result of McNaughton's suspicions, Druitt is high up on the list of Ripper suspects, yet the case against him is entirely dependent on McNaughton supposedly possessing more information than he wished to reveal, which then he later claimed to have destroyed so as not to cause an uproar. Montague John Druitt may have been Jack the Ripper, but he equally may have been simply a tragic figure who, in taking his own life around the time that the murders ended, ensured that his name came to the attention of the police as they desperately sought a solution to the fate of the Whitechapel murderer. Could a deranged, distraught lawyer have been responsible for the killings? Desperate men are responsible for a lot of ill will if we are to believe fiction stories and other narratives, but what about someone close to the victims? Someone who even lived with one of them? An obsessed lover turned killer, perhaps? I will now present the case for and against Joseph Barnett. Barnett was the roommate, as you will remember, of the fifth and final Ripper victim, Mary Kelly. While they were solely roommates, Barnett would often refer to Kelly as his wife, which could implicate shades of jealousy, especially when Kelly returned to the streets to work as a prostitute after Barnett lost his job around July of 1888. On October 30th, Barnett and Kelly have a fight at 13 Miller's Court, during which a window is broken, and Joseph leaves the home to take up a new lodging in Bishopsgate. It is said that the quarrel between the two occurred because Kelly was allowing several prostitutes into the home to share their lodgings. Between November 1st through the 8th, Barnett visits Kelly often, giving her money and seemed to be on friendly terms with her. On November 9th, Kelly is found murdered at 13 Miller's Court. On the whole, Barnett does actually match the physical description of the Ripper given by many witnesses. He was 30 years old and of medium build. He had a fair complexion and a mustache, blue eyes, and was around 5'7". He also likely had a speech impediment called echolalia, which caused him to repeat the last words spoken to him when replying to a question.
And I didn't know that had a name.
Barnett also fits well with the FBI psychological profile of the Ripper done in 1986, which mentions that the killer would have had a passive or absent father. Barnett's father was dead. That the killer had a profession in which he could legally experience his destructive tendencies. As a fish porter, he would have had plenty experience in deboning and gutting fish. The Ripper ceased killing because he was either arrested or felt himself close to being discovered as the killer. Barnett was interviewed for 4 hours after the Kelly murder, but was not pursued any further by police, and that the killer had some sort of physical defect which was a source of anger and frustration, his echolalia and speech impediment. The prevailing theory was that Barnett was in love with Kelly and was growing tired and jealous of her prostituting herself to other men. He believed he could support her enough to keep her off the streets, and for a time that worked. But the loss of his job caused Kelly to have no recourse but to return to her old profession in order to make ends meet. This infuriated Barnett, and in an ill-conceived attempt to scare Kelly off the street, Barnett raged through Whitechapel and murdered a handful of prostitutes in the fall of 1888. His efforts would ultimately prove futile, and the tempers between Barnett and Kelly boiled over in late October, culminating on their final fight on the 30th. Perhaps realizing that Kelly was determined to return to the streets and that his love for her was ultimately unrequited, Barnett murdered her with the bloody rage and fury of a scorned lover. With this final act, there was no need to kill more prostitutes, as the woman he was determined to keep off the streets was dead herself, so this is why the killing ceased after Kelly's death. There were ginger beer bottles also found at 13 Miller's Court on November 9th, which are referenced in the Dear Boss letter. Also, Kelly's door had been locked when police arrived on the scene, which would indicate that either the murderer had access to a key, which Barnett could certainly still have had even after moving out, or he knew where one would be kept in the room. There are some distinct possibilities here, but who's to say that an accusation has to be based on facts when it could be based in good old xenophobia? Yes, every criminal court actually says that thing, but let's play along and uncomfortably wade into the waters of old-fashioned turn-of-the-century racism with suspect Chaim Hyams. So this one stinks of old-timey racism at its finest. The area where the Jack the Ripper murders occurred was highly populated with Jewish immigrants. The tensions were high between Jewish and non-Jewish residents. When the Whitechapel murders began, non-Jewish residents immediately started to point at the Jews living in the area. In fact, their first suspect was a Jewish man, John Pizer, who had the nickname of Leather Apron, which, fun fact about this nickname, even he didn't know why he had it. When questioned, he said that he had worn a leather apron home from work, but had not done so for some time because he'd been out of work. Can you imagine, giving people nicknames just, based on their clothing? Hey, Leather Apron. Hey, fucking corduroy pants. Hey, khaki shorts. We don't like the cut of your jib around here. That's weird. That's weird. Back to our narrative, though. Even though John Pizer had been cleared of the murders, everyone was still on the hunt for a Jewish culprit for some reason. People blamed the murders on real and fictional Jewish rituals and customs, and there was a wide belief that, quote, no Englishman could be responsible for such brutal and barbaric crimes, unquote. Sir Robert Anderson had this to say to the readers of Blackwood's magazine, quote, one did not have to be a Sherlock Holmes to discover that the criminal was a sexual maniac of a virulent type. Oh, don't worry, he was living in the immediate vicinity of the scenes of the murders, and that, if he was not living absolutely alone, his people knew of his guilt and refused to give him up to justice. During my absence abroad, the police had made a house-to-house search for him, investigating cases of every man in the district whose circumstances were such that he could go and come and get rid of his bloodstains in secret. And the conclusion we came to was that he and his people were low-class Jews, and the result proved that our diagnosis was right on every point. Yikes. Unquote. While others, like Sir Melville Macnaghten, would name such people as Aaron Kosminski and David Cohen as suspects, theorist Mark King suspected Chaim Hyams, an apparent, quote, Jewish lunatic. In 1881, Hyams was living at 29 Mitre Street, Aldgate, with his mother, 3 brothers, 2 sisters, and his brother-in-law. He was a fruiterer, otherwise known as a fruit salesman. Just say he was sold fruit. By the time the Ripper murders had occurred, Hyam had married and had 2 children, a son William and a daughter named Kate. On December 29, 1888, at around 6 o'clock in the morning, Hyams was sent to Whitechapel Workhouse Infirmary, diagnosed with delirium tremens, otherwise known as a disordered state of mind, usually accompanied by hallucinations and terrifying delusions brought on by severe alcoholism or alcohol withdrawal. He was discharged 13 days later, but however was readmitted on April 15, 1889. He was described as, quote, violent and dangerous, especially to his wife. He'd injured his mother's head with a chopper when attacking his wife. He's epileptic and irritable after fits, and addicted to drink, unquote. He was discharged 4.5 months later, but then, only 10 days later, on the 9th of September, was admitted to the City of London Lunatic Asylum at Stone, Kent, as a, quote, insane person after having attacked and stabbed his wife. His wife claimed that she had 4 miscarriages because of his increasingly dangerous behavior, as he believed she was cheating on him, and that for the past 9 years he had had periodic epileptic attacks and was becoming increasingly more violent. Hyams was also said to practice, quote, self-abuse, aka masturbation, which was commonly thought of to be a root cause of madness at the time.
All day long.
Hyams was sent back to Colney Hatch Asylum on January 4th, 1890. He was described as, quote, crafty and dangerous. For example, he had asked for a knife so that he could kill himself, but that when he got a hold of a piece of sharp steel, he used it to attack one of the medical personnel by cutting his neck. So why was he suspected? Well, he was Jewish, first of all. Anti-Semitic graffiti was found in the area of Catherine Eddowes' murder shortly after her death. Second, he was deemed as a lunatic, and he became progressively more violent and had attacked more than one person with a knife. The first time he was institutionalized was around 7 weeks after Mary Kelly's murder, which is when the murders stopped. He was raised on Mitre Street, which was right off Mitre Square, where Catherine Eddowes had been murdered and her body had been discovered outside of number 8 Mitre Street, which had also been operated as a cigar manufacturing business by Hyams' uncle, Louis Levy. Also, after Chaim Hyams was admitted to the Whitechapel Workhouse Infirmary the first time, he gave his address as 217 Jubilee Street. Right next door was a leather shop owned by Mr. Marsh. In October of 1888, Emily, Marsh's daughter, said that a, quote, tall, strange man dressed in a long black coat with either a Prussian or clerical collar entered and asked for the address of George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, unquote. She had sent one of the boys working in the shop to follow the man, and, quote, later on, a man loosely fitting the description of the stranger was seen by Lusk watching his house. This was followed by Lusk receiving the so-called Lusk kidney in the mail, unquote. This would also explain the differences between the Dear Boss letter and the From Hell letter. If Chaim Hyams was progressively becoming worse mentally, the way he wrote would also change, leading to the nearly illiterate, crazed From Hell letter. Could he have been Jack the Ripper? It's entirely possible. Some of the evidence is circumstantial, but seeing as he was never a suspect to Sir Robert Anderson, there was no real investigation into him, which doesn't lead to any real evidence that he was Jack the Ripper. It possibly could have been Hyams, or at least somebody who had a similar mental condition or illness, but unfortunately the truth of the matter will remain a mystery. While I have presented some good solid cases here for and against each of these possibilities being the Ripper, there are some theories out there that seem more like Reddit-grade fan fiction than anything based in actual facts.
So a couple of those are ones that these are bonus ones I'm going to go over really quickly since that was a lot of suspects, y'all. I tried to be very thorough. There were a few that I had to leave out because I only have so much time. So George Chapman, who was a serial killer at the time in London, is put forth as being Jack the Ripper. Unfortunately, his motive was completely different. He killed wives by poisoning, did not stab them, did not kill prostitutes, and as we discussed last week, generally those motives don't change. H.H. Holmes is another one that is a serial killer who has also been put forth as being Jack the Ripper. The reason that the murder stopped is because he fled London, came to the United States, changed his name to H.H. Holmes, which we know that's not true. There are birth records for H.H. Holmes in New England. We know he was raised there. He did not immigrate from England at all. The timeline doesn't line up, nor does the motive. So that's one that I think people just want to tack on because they're already existent serial killers. And they're like, well, they're already crazy and they're already killing people. So why wouldn't they have killed more people? Well, because rarely do serial killers change their motives. They find a comfortable way of killing people and they don't change that. Charles Cross is another suspect that is kind of gaining more popularity. He was one of the ones that found the first body of Polly Nichols. And he was suspected and questioned multiple times by the police, but they never really honed in on him or were never able to produce anything that made him an actual suspect, other than the fact that he lived in the area. And that was a going theory that it had to have been somebody who's familiar with the Whitechapel area and familiar with the streets in a way that he could get away and move with impunity the way he did. So
He's one that's like kind of up there too in the theory nest. There's a lot. Again, there's over 500 suspects, you guys. These were just 8 out of 500. And a couple of them were like me, you know, I covered them because they're popular theories like the royal conspiracy theory. The odds of that one being actually real, but it's a fun story. It's fun. You know, so there. Suffice to say, if anyone ever does solve this over 130-year-old crime, that it would be the cold case to end all cold cases. But unfortunately, also, perhaps it will be one of those unsolved mysteries best left to the ages. Unless we invent time machines, that is. Then all bets are off. All bets are off if we invent time machines. We invent time machines, well, I already know the first 2 things I'm going back and doing when they invent time machines. Number 1, I'm going back and making friends with a dinosaur. Number 2, I'm going back in time to punch a pilgrim directly in the face. I'm going to step out of the time machine and just pop him right in his fucking buckle-hatted jib. He knows why. He knows why. Maybe the third thing is to go find Jack the Ripper. Maybe the third thing. But first 2, dinosaur, punch pilgrim, done. So those are the suspects. I only had so much time, but there are a couple really good websites if you guys are really interested in wanting to know more of some of the other suspects that are in the case that have either very little information on them or have just different theories that I just didn't have time to cover tonight. So there's Casebook Jack the Ripper. It's casebook.org. There's also jacktheripper.org that are some pretty like well put together websites that present a lot of the pieces of evidence, photos, reproductions of maps, things like that. So it lets you kind of paw through all of the evidence yourself and kind of like draw your own conclusions. Plus there's message boards on there. I mean, people have been trying to solve this since it happened. So, you know, you can go through and read people's theories at your leisure. I mean, I could do like a whole fucking season on Jack the Ripper. Like there's that much there. So thank you for joining me. Sorry, this one was a little bit long because there was a lot to cover. I keep doing this. I don't know why. Some from obscure, yes, from obscure to the silly popular ones. Yeah, there's some that I'm like, really? Like this one was popular? Why? To one that I was like, I felt really bad for Montague John Druitt because I knew his name and I had heard his name before. And then like really reading into him, I was like, oh, well, this guy just got lumped in because of bad fucking timing. That sucks. Thank you guys. Thank you so much. Yes, this was a lot. This was a lot of work. I might forego next week because Paraflix is going live very soon and I need to have a couple more episodes on there. So for paranormal content, please go subscribe to Paraflix if you haven't. All of my interviews with paranormal investigators are actually moving to paraflix.com. I will have 4 brand new interviews with people you haven't seen yet on there as soon as it launches on the 21st. There will be all new interviews, and I'm going to re-interview some people you already have seen, definitely on there. So we'll do follow-up interviews. It's going to be fun. So next week, I may not do a murder corner. Don't quote me on that. I may not do one because I may have to catch up on some deadlines with Paraflix. But if I get my stuff done, I may surprise you guys with a little bonus episode, and we'll get into some stuff. So, who do you want to see next when we do a big one? Throw some names out. Don't be shy. You're welcome. I finish my drinky poo. You're welcome. You're welcome. Anyone have any suggestions? Zodiac. Ooh. I also have performances of somebody already playing Zodiac, so that one would be easy. Peter Sutcliffe is a good. The Yorkshire Ripper. That would be an interesting follow-up. And he just died recently. He just died not so long. Oh, Black Dahlia. Dude, Ghost. Black Dahlia is my favorite. Like, this is my second favorite of all time. Black Dahlia is my favorite unsolved crime of all time. I am going to do a Black Dahlia episode, but I'm going to do it radio drama style. I don't know if you guys are familiar with like the old radio dramas back in the 30s when there was no TV. So they would have people playing different parts on the radio. I'm going to have to get a bunch of actors to do, and we're going to do it like 1930s radio show style. It's going to be awesome. Yes, Eileen Wuornos. I think, you know what? Fair point. I think it's time we do some show some love to the ladies, right? Like, I haven't done a lady serial killer yet. So maybe that'll be the next one. Will be a female serial killer. So I could either do Eileen Wuornos. I could do there was the one that fed her victims to pigs, and her name is escaping me right now, but she's like she's badass, like, and disappeared. Like, they don't even know. I mean, obviously she's dead now because she'd be like 200 years old, but like, she was like fucking crazy and hardcore. Like, yeah. So let's one of the ladies. Let's do that. Let's make that happen. We're going to make that a thing. All right. Yes. Radio drama. Like, it's going to be so cool. It's going to be so cool. And like, I'm going to grab people that you've had. Belle Gunnis. Thank you, Ghost. Yes. Belle Gunnis. So, I think we might do a lady next week. That sounded wrong. Ladies night. Hell yeah. But radio drama, dude, it's going to be so rad. I just have to like, there's going to be a lot of coordination with that one because I'm going to need to sync people's parts together and have people do different recordings. It's going to be a lot, but it's going to be fucking awesome. So thank you guys for joining. Also, if anyone's interested in, hold on, where's my banner? Where's my banner, you guys? Be a guest on the Dead Hours, or if you know somebody that wants to be a guest on the Dead Hours, on interview, whatever, send me an email. There it is. Thank you guys for joining me tonight. I will hopefully, like I said, we might do a quick bonus episode. We won't do the lady serial killer one probably this week, just because I am having to catch up on those deadlines. That'll be the next major one, but I might surprise you with like a bonus little, like, quick, maybe serial killer countdown, or just like a quickie, like roundup episode, but it'll be a properly researched episode the following week. I promise I won't leave you hanging. So even if it has to be an after dark. So yes, Polly, thank you so much. Hold on, let me go back to my actual comments here. Thank you, Polly, for playing Jack the Ripper last week on last week's episode. If nobody saw it, please go back and watch it, and then watch this one so you can kind of make your own theories. Make a note of them in the comments of who you think it is. There's a lot of possibilities because there's lots of pros and cons. So thank you guys again. Have a wonderful evening and stay spooky. And don't get murdered. That would suck.